Incident in the Riesending cave. It was June 8, 2014, when 52-year-old German speleologist Johann Westhauser entered the Riesending cave, located in the Bavarian Alps, southern Germany. He was accompanied by two colleagues. The cave, considered the deepest in the country, was a vertical labyrinth with more than 1,100 meters of depth and 19 kilometers of mapped passages. They had descended more than 1,000 meters below the surface when everything happened. Johann was leading the group when a rock suddenly detached from one of the walls. The stone struck his head with force. He collapsed to the ground, unconscious. When he regained consciousness, he was confused, weak, and showing clear signs of traumatic brain injury. At the bottom of the cave, there was no signal, no radio, no means of contacting the outside world. The place was narrow, full of uneven terrain, and had a temperature close to 3 degrees Celsius. One of his colleagues stayed with Johann, covering him with makeshift thermal blankets and trying to keep him awake. The other began a solitary ascent to the surface. It took nearly 12 hours of climbing through vertical tunnels, using makeshift ladders, slippery shafts, and tight passages where only one person could crawl at a time. When he finally reached the top, it was already dawn. He alerted the authorities, and the response was immediate. Rescue teams began organizing within hours. By the next day, more than 200 rescuers were on their way, many of them veterans of underground operations. In the days that followed, that number would grow to over 700 people involved, from 5 different countries: Germany, Austria, Switzerland, Italy, and Croatia. All with one single goal: to get Johann out alive. The logistics of the operation were described as monstrous. The cave was so deep and treacherous that kilometers of wired communication cables had to be installed, since no radio signal could reach those depths. Metal ladders, safety ropes, anchor points, support tents, and even an improvised medical equipment transport system were set up inside the underground labyrinth. Each journey down to Johann's location required more than 10 hours of continuous descent through vertical shafts, narrow ramps, and dark chambers soaked in humidity. To keep him stable, rescuers worked in continuous shifts. They brought drinking water, high-calorie food, medication, thermal blankets, and portable heating systems. Johann remained lying down, conscious but extremely weak and vulnerable. There was a constant risk of infection, hypothermia, and fainting. The medical team that stayed with him set up an emergency care point right there inside the cave. The rescue plan involved placing Johann in a special stretcher designed for extreme environments like that. The stretcher was secured with straps, padded with protective foam, and tied to suspension ropes. In the most vertical sections, it was hoisted using pulley systems. In the tighter tunnels, the stretcher was slowly dragged along slippery trails, barely wide enough for a lying adult. In some parts, it had to be turned sideways to fit, scraping against the walls of solid rock. At every sudden jolt, Johann cried out in pain. To allow rescuers to move forward, stopover and relay stations were set up, where teams could rest, recover, and take turns carrying the load. The rescue lasted exactly 11 days. And during that time, Johann's body temperature was monitored every few hours. In several critical moments, he had to be wrapped in sleeping bags heated with chemical packs to prevent his temperature from dropping too low. In other parts of the journey, volunteers faced internal waterfalls, muddy galleries, and slips that could have ruined everything. With every step forward, the risk was real. But they never stopped. On June 22, 2014, after more than 250 hours of operation, Johann finally emerged from the cave entrance. He was conscious, breathing with difficulty, but alive. He was immediately airlifted by helicopter to a hospital in Munich. He survived. The operation, estimated to cost over €1 million, was considered the most expensive and complex in the history of European speleology. Despite the risk, the depth, and the extreme difficulty, not a single rescuer was injured during the mission. Days later, once out of danger, Johann personally thanked the dozens of teams involved, one by one. This case went down in history as an extreme example of human resilience, international cooperation, and courage in the harshest of environments. Incident at Ogof, Ffynnon cave, Saturday, November 6, 2021. Civil engineer and experienced caver George Linnane, 38 years old, set out once again to explore the underground passages of Ogof Ffynnon cave in Wales. The name means Cave of the Black Spring in Welsh, and it is the second deepest cave in the United Kingdom. A stone labyrinth filled with tight tunnels, abrupt drops, and flooded passages, stretching for more than 30 kilometers. George was not alone. He was part of a group of seasoned cavers familiar with the area. The expedition seemed routine. They were used to the treacherous terrain and fully aware of the risks. But that afternoon, in one of the cave's most remote and dangerous sections, everything changed. During the exploration, everything was going smoothly until George crossed a delicate area and suffered a fall of approximately 10 meters. The impact was brutal. He fractured his jaw, broke his collarbone, and sustained multiple fractures in his leg. His teammates immediately realized how serious the situation was. The spot where he fell was extremely inaccessible. Over 1 kilometer from the cave entrance, down a narrow and winding path. It was impossible to get him out quickly, and certainly not without specialized help. With no cell signal, one of the team members returned to the surface to call for help. The search for assistance was tense. The cave, extremely humid, narrow, and dark, was a true challenge. Even more so when someone is in distress and desperate to find help. The alarm was raised, and within hours, the rescue operation began to be mobilized. More than 300 volunteer rescuers from all over Britain took part in the mission. They worked in shifts, facing total darkness, narrow passages, and constant cold, bringing medicine, water, and food. When the rescuers finally reached him to begin the rescue, they immobilized George and placed him on the stretcher with some difficulty, as he had suffered numerous fractures. He was lifted out of the pit using pulleys and other tools. The team then began the journey back to the surface, facing many narrow, slippery, wet, and freezing passages. Despite all the challenges, they managed to transport George to the surface of the cave. It was 54 hours of nonstop rescue. 3 days of extreme tension. With every passing hour, the situation grew more delicate. But finally, at 8:45 p.m. on Monday, November 8th, George Linnane was brought out of the cave in an operation worthy of a movie, but entirely real. He was immediately airlifted to Cardiff University Hospital, where he underwent surgery and remained under intensive care. Despite the severity of his injuries, George survived. The cave was permanently closed, and no one is allowed to enter it anymore. Cave exploration can bring a mix of thrill, adventure, and adrenaline. But despite all of that, these places are extremely treacherous. And you? Would you have the courage to face an expedition like this? This was today's video. If you enjoyed this content, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. A big hug from Mr. Square.